I would like to introduce you to the participants tonight. First of all, Judith Linhares, who comes to us originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, but has been in New York forever almost. And her work is sort of a combination of abstraction and figuration. But really, I think one of the major things about her work is she is a master of color. And I am very excited to have her here. And we have also been friends for a very long time. I think she came to notoriety through an exhibition called Bad Painting. And that was curated by the late Marcia Tucker, who was the founder and director of the new museum. And she'll be in conversation with essentially here, Jennifer Samet, who teaches at the New York Studio School. She is an art historian and a writer and a curator. And she also writes for Hyperallergic magazine. So please join me in welcoming our guests tonight, and we can begin the conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm so happy to be able to talk with Judith Linhares, whose work I really love. And fun fact, my interview with Judith was actually the first Beer with a Painter interview to be published in Hyperallergic. That was back in 2012. So thank you. I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. So we're starting with some autobiographical photographs. And Judy, you were born in Pasadena, California, and you're a fourth-generation Californian. You've described your childhood as, in part, embodying a psychic conflict between repression and abandon. Your parents' generation was obsessed with being outdoors, bodybuilding, and swimming, and you hung out on Muscle Beach. But you also spent a lot of time with your church-going Baptist grandmother. And I wonder if you can talk about how this dynamic has informed you and how the conflict plays out or resonates in your work as we look at these.
Well, reviewing these pictures of my relatives, this is my mother, I've had a lot more compassion for them than I used to, in that they were young people during the Great Depression, and then they were young adults at the beginning of World War II. So they, they were trying to live their lives very energetically and vigorously. And I think my problem wasn't maybe my grandmother, but I think it was possibly the greater culture. This is my lovely daughter. You can see that this genetic material gets passed along very nicely. They're exceptionally photogenic and athletic. I really think that the conflict, and there's definitely a conflict between abandon and maybe just the idea of pleasure, and enjoying your body and enjoying nature, and the general culture, which what was happening when I was young was that there was a trying to bring in back from the workplace all the women who had been out there surviving on equal footing with the men, pretty much. And I think it was more the reinvention of women as good housewives and in the kitchen with their new appliances, and that sort of recreation of the general culture of putting a really commodification of women. So even though my grandmother her father was a singing Baptist preacher, she really didn't proselytize me about the Bible or anything. In fact, she occasionally played the piano for silent movies. It's a big part of this ancestral visitation also is that where the family home was, and I was growing up, was where Cal Arts is now, north and east of Los Angeles. And it was the site of where a lot of cowboy movies were made. And my family's property abutted William S. Hart's property, who was the first cowboy movie star. And the proximity of the entertainment industry, I think, encouraged I think they had show business in mind, really, when they were taking these photographs. And in one of the photographs, it's actually me as a 5-year-old being held up by my uncle. And they were inviting me into the tribe. So I think the conflict really did come more from the general culture than from my grandmother specifically, even though she was very, not a lot of fun, kind of glum, but I think that had to do more with old-fashioned depression than anything to do with the Bible. And this is my 3rd year of art school with my lovely daughter. And I like to show this as evidence of the artist's life and the particular sorts of challenges about who you are as an artist, what your life should be like. And right at this moment, the artists that I admired were going belly up to the bar on Cedar Street. And I was happily involved in a very domestic life. This is a still from a movie that means a lot to me. It was like one of those moments where the pieces begin to come together for some unknown reason. It's a still from the movie Children of Paradise. And it was filmed under Nazi occupation in France in the 40s, and it came out in 1945. So when I saw it, it was already an old movie. But I think the fact that it's so central representation of love. Love is really the subject. And the form of the movie is amazing, and it's full of archetypal characters. The thief, the nobleman, the poor artist, and they come across in a very archetypal fashion. And the idea of the play within the play. So it was not only the story and the content, but also the extreme formality of the film that really moved me and inspired me and changed my work. I think, like everybody of my generation, I really was trained as an artist with high formalist notions in mind. But as you're a student, or particularly me, I really felt like I needed to express something about life. And for some reason, that movie freed me. And this, I consider, it's a Conte crayon on bond paper, basically. And it was the first time that I drew from my imagination. And there was something about the process that was really freeing. And during, I don't know, a year's period, I did possibly hundreds of these drawings. And I drew on the floor and I drew from memory. And it was a key for me. And it set me in motion, and it made me committed to my feelings in a way, and my priorities, that I was a woman and I had desires and I had interests, and this was really my real life, and I wanted to represent it. That abstraction really wasn't going to be the thing that gave me a wide enough field to play in, really.
Mm-hmm. So you studied at the California College of Arts and Crafts, and this actually led into a period where you weren't painting, but you made drawings and sculptural installation pieces, and we can start looking at some of those. Can you talk a little bit about the impulse to incorporate items from popular culture, kitsch objects, and also, as you've said, to sort of reappropriate the idea of making art like a girl?
Yes.
What should we look at while we're talking about this?
Go back to the table. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a point where I was making one bad painting after another, and I really felt oppressed by art history, basically. That I felt this notion, as anybody who went to school in the same time period I did, that progress was an idea that was large. And, you had to come up with something new, like there was that kind of pressure. And I also didn't particularly identify with the heroes that put forth. I didn't feel like it was my art history. It really didn't represent much about my life as I was living it. And so I just wanted to make something that would escape all definition, and especially art historic definitions. And I also wanted to bust out of some boundaries between craft and high art, and what is serious, what is utilitarian, all those questions. And I mean, I actually feel as though the environment of growing up in Los Angeles with the entertainment industry so close by, that I can say that I was colonized by Disney really early on. And I think about the history and the people that were there making the art, the early Disney films that were enormously imprinted on me. And they were really escapees from Europe, many of them. And it's not that I consider it on par, but I give it respect and room. So it was really great to make these pieces because I got to go to the hardware store instead of the art supply store to get materials. I got to use the bandsaw. I got my own power tools. And it was great for a while until it wasn't. Do we have another sculptural piece? Well, all these, this is earlier. This is probably in the 60s. And this definitely has kitsch elements, like religious kitsch elements in it. The draw.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And also it's, growing up in Los Angeles, the presence of Mexican culture is ubiquitous and was, and I'm so pleased that it's finally being recognized as a big influence on modernism. And the skeleton is kind of a homage to Mexican art. And this is a piece of, and this is gouache on paper. Done in the 60s. And this is sort of my retreat from making big, ugly, out of control, abstract paintings, that I'm going to this very sort of methodical rendering of objects.
In San Francisco, you also became connected to underground comic culture. And I wonder how this connection and other aspects of the cultural scene in the Bay Area at that moment played out in your work.
Yes. There was, I mean, it's sort of a thorn in my paw in that there's so little described about what the Bay Area was like, especially during the 70s. There was a lot of creative energy from a lot of different directions. And there were a lot of really interesting, great emerging women artists that were also around at this time. And it was, the social circles were overlapping, I would say. And the underground comic people were part of my circle of acquaintances and friends. And I was really impressed by their work ethic. I was impressed by their drawing skills. I was impressed by their entrepreneurial efforts to construct a economic system completely outside of the preview of art, high art. So there was a lot of overlap and learning. It was nice. At that time, I wasn't that familiar with very many women cartoonists. I'm sure there were some, but I didn't really meet any in that period.
So your first teaching job was in San Jose, and it was also around this period that you mentioned Mexico, that you took a 4-month trip to Mexico. And I wonder how these images of skeletons converge in this work with tropes of femininity, and what you were interested in communicating through this amalgamation. We can look at a few of these.
Yes, I mean, I think my admiration for Mexican culture really started with ideas around the Day of the Dead, where not, different from Madison Avenue and their construction of a picture of America and what life should be like with your new appliances and so forth. the Mexican culture was putting out work and producing work that was not afraid of death, not afraid of death being part of life. And so I think that I found that really something new and very attractive. And the trip to Mexico was really inspired by Jose Guadalupe Posada, who lived in Guanajuato, and that's where I was located for 4 months. And one of the great things about Guanajuato is that they buried their body, they're dead in just the earth, and they discovered that it mummified the bodies. And then they exhumed them and they made a museum around them. And then they make a sort of taffy kind of candy that they sell as souvenirs. And there's just something about that life-death cycle that was irresistible.
Mm-hmm.
And this, actually, I called my first show, Love Letters from San Jose. And I had a few of these drawings. And I think of the skeletons being dressed up in a gender-specific way. So at this time, I also was very involved in feminism. And I was sending some kind of message here.
I'm trying to get, oh, here is some more of the
Yes.
work we were looking for earlier. Okay. I was trying to get up to this one, which is called Sailor from 1976. And then thinking back to also the staging of yourself
Yes.
As Van Gogh, cutting off your ear, how you're playing with a kind of reversing of gendered points of view. And I wonder about these parodies almost, whether they're politically intentioned, whether they're meant to be humorous or both. What kinds of comments were you making with this work?
Yes, I think that they are, well, I know that they are. The intention was an investigation, really. I belonged to a women's group for 10 years in the Bay Area. And one of the propositions that we talked about one evening was how threatening crazy women are. And are they more threatening than crazy men? And so the idea of picking out an artist that was known for his craziness in the popular mind, and dressing up in an extra pretty dress with the edging around the side that is really sort of like a ruffle. It's taking a lot of feminine tropes and kind of putting them into the Van Gogh story. And there's things that bother me about the popular imagination of artists, and the Van Gogh situation is one of them, where he's really thought of as a crazy person, and that this art comes out of him just automatically, that his biography equals his art. That's And that seems to be a notion that's very much afoot in the present moment, that the audience is confused about what the process actually is of making art, and where it comes from. So I don't think, even though my enjoyment of Van Gogh's work is his mind, he's brilliant and methodical beyond, and that's the elation that I get beyond story of any kind.
Mm. So at this point, you got back into painting.
Yes.
And you've said you felt ready to take on art history at this point. And
Right.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your feelings about painting, or else the limitations of the sculptural work at that moment.
Could we go back to
Yeah.
some of the constructions, like the little house? Maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. There.
Tell me when to stop.
Yes. So this is still, this was in my first show. So this was produced in the 60s. And this is while I'm still rejecting all forms of traditional art. Except I was doing the trompe l'oeil paintings at the same time. The other work I was doing was highly graphic. And I basically, and this happened on the trip to Mexico, and after a big show that I had in San Francisco, I decided it was time to revisit painting. And because these really were just ideas that were popping into my head, and then I would construct them, I missed that all or nothing experience that you get from actually painting. And I also love form. So I went back to my original education, which basically is formalist. And I understood the need for that language, that I did not really, as an artist, want to be content driven. I really wanted to have a process that would take me somewhere that I didn't know, that was unfamiliar, that would surprise me. Instead of the work coming from my head and out of my fingers with, problem solving along the way. So I think my craving, I was over my fear. I was ready to endure the bad paintings that we're all destined to make. And that's part of the thrill, is that you can fail. And that there's a lot on the line. So this is when I'm sort of tiptoeing back into painting, and this is certainly not gestural, and this is gouache on paper. And it's, of course, highly narrative. And it's this monstrous female mermaid. And of course, we all know the story of harpies and sirens and people, specifically women, that are out there waiting to trap innocent sailors. And so I'm really relishing taking on this role as monster, sailor-eating monster. And these paintings now are getting into real painting for me. This painting actually came about it didn't happen so much the way my more recent paintings happen. It was inspired by an event in Mexico where I came face to face out in the wilderness with a turkey, and he fanned his tail at me, and it was memorable. And again, I'm courting ideas of decoration with the pink ruffle that goes around the edge of the painting. The painting has touch all over it, really. It's really that physical information that tells you how an object is made in real time. And it was included in the, for better or worse, bad painting show.
Oh yeah, tell us about that. You were included in the 1978 landmark show that was called Bad Painting,
Yes.
Curated by Marcia Tucker. And I know it was a turning point in your life and career. And I wonder how it inspired you and how it helped contextualize your work, and whether you still think of that aesthetic that Marcia Tucker defined as a valid context for your work.
I've really given it a lot of thought. And I certainly think it's still valid. I mean, one of the big things that she wanted to accomplish with the show was to bring in artists that were working in different communities than in New York, although there were a number of artists from New York in the show. I think she wanted to challenge the status quo in very specifically New York, and very specifically the kind of formal language that was a necessity. And what's come to light recently is how that language has marginalized a lot of artists because of proximity of region or culture, race. And I think that I know she wanted to make an institution that was more responsive to current activities in the art world. I dare say not trends, but things, museums take a long time to put a show together. So she wanted to invent an institution that was responsive to what was currently going on. And I think she accomplished it. And certainly there's still a need for that. And then the other part of the show was to challenge well, it was to challenge aesthetic notions. And she was trying to draw a connection between the avant-garde and ideas of ugliness or grotesqueness or, and I think, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. New things, you know, people don't take to them right away. So I think there's still a need for art that challenges on aesthetic terms. I don't think anybody in the bad painting show set out to make bad paintings or or clumsy paintings even, or unaesthetic paintings.
I know that you're very interested in dreams, and for I think you said since 1972 you've been writing down your dreams, and you've also explored the technique of lucid dreaming. And I wonder how that has informed your painting process or maybe even your imagery?
Let's see. Well, one thing I wanted to say is I never work from my dreams. Even though I write them down, it's more like the painting is a parallel process. And the dreams are really for exploring what it is I'm trying to repress from my conscious mind. What do I really think about that? So it's a way of building a consciousness. And that was part of my coming of age in San Francisco in the 70s. It was very open to all kinds of ideas drifting in from the greater world. There was an interest in anthropology, and there was an interest in what tribal life might have been about, which kind of opened the door to ideas about archetype and certainly ecstatic states. And so that's really what keeps me motivated, is and with the painting as well. I want to find out something that I didn't know in a new way. And that's basically why and how I went back to painting, that I needed a language that was really specific, that would be like a cup, getting water from a well. And the dreams are like that too. They're for information, really, but not particularly imagery.
Animals play a central role as characters in your work, and you represent them as iconic or mythical and also playful. And as you sort of mentioned earlier, in communion, with one another or with people. Can these moments of recognition or communication be traced to specific experiences in your life or to stories that are of interest to you?
Yes, I mean, really, the depressed grandmother was full of warnings about wild animals. And in truth, there are a lot of wild animals in the Los Angeles area. I'm still following stories about wild animals there. I got such a kick out of one recently before the pandemic about mountain lions are a very common sighting, and they're not to be dismissed. It's very serious, but the gene pool got interrupted by the freeway that came through their two places where they get together. And one lion, mountain lion, got through to the Santa Monica canyons and wreaked havoc, but he was tracked. And he had his own Facebook page, which is, well, actually he died in one of the fires, I found out, which is sad. But so there were always warnings about wild animals, and not just from my grandmother, from everyone. You did not leave your toddler out in the yard because of coyotes. So and also my family in general, they talk to each other through the dog. Well, Skippy thinks it's dinner time. So there was a lot of imagining around animals.
I wonder if you can also talk about your interest in fairy tales.
Yes, I think it comes from first being interested in archetypes and being interested in mythology. And then fairy tales became very specifically interesting for me because they were more about domestic life, that it really did involve labor and work in a domestic kind of peasant kind of way. And there's something that is passed on orally. And they're a rich source of inspiration, I would say. And the direct connection is Marie-Louise von Franz, who actually came to the Bay Area and spoke in the 70s. And she's an expert and a Jungian analyst and an expert on fairy tales.
Yeah, so those two interests, because you're interested in Jungian ideas as well. So those connected, interest in Jung and in
then the
tales.
feminist aspect also, because well, it's the part that I've concentrated on are the witches and women with brooms, women doing the work.
One thing that we've talked about before is how even though there's a multiplicity of references and even pictorial traditions in your work, that it's important to you to create this single coherent image. And I wonder how that's connected for you to your love of abstract expressionism and your interest in the ideas of Leo Steinberg.
That really was coming right along. Let's say when I decided that I wanted to paint again. And always I had a love of form, and I could recognize it in other art forms, not just painting. And the idea of significant form was really what I think my education was really about. And for me, it's really defining the space first of all, and the light, and having that come about in process. And that was what was interesting for me with the abstract expressionists, was that there was a sense of improvisation that was happening in the very moment. And what you were risking was real chaos. And what you had to gain was this amazing moment of wholeness in the parts coming together in relationship to the whole. And I always have that in mind. With these smaller flower paintings, which I've had one going always in my studio probably since 2000. For me, they're like little abstract paintings, really. And this one was one of the ones that was really sort of a gift. It only took one kind of go around. It truly was spontaneous. And often they get rearranged a lot over a period of time. But it really is the obsession with the idea of the parts having a expressive relationship to one another. And you really do see that. I mean, that really seems to be the subject in abstraction. And it really is a purely visual experience. And what I particularly like about abstract expressionism is the way it directly expresses the body. And even as a viewer, it expresses the body in that you have to find the right distance to the painting initially. And it's very easy to kind of empathize with the maker and get that sort of thrill in real time about the experience. And that's pretty much when I decided that I did not want to be strictly content driven, story driven. It's fine to have a story after the fact. I also didn't want to give up story either. So that's really been the difficulty of my journey, is not giving up anything, really maintaining scale and having the space through all the means possible, the size of the brushstroke, being bigger in the front, going smaller in the back, and often this sort of conflict between foreground and ground where it doesn't go straight back, that you are always aware of the presence of the surface. And yeah, this is a better example of that. That it's risky business, but worth it.
I know that you often begin paintings by creating a striped ground. Is that true? And why do you do this?
Yes, and often I'll divide the canvas of this one. They're the same on both sides, but when I start, I'll make the colors on one side different than the colors on the right side. And
should we go to another one? Another work?
Nah, that doesn't work either. The more complicated, there, yeah. Well, you can see the orange underpainting here, but I'm thinking right, left, light on dark, dark on light. I'm thinking about the construction of the painting, and it's actually a bit like a stage in that I'm placing the objects or whatever is going on there, in this case, chicken in the plate, in the space. So it has the illusion of depth, but when you actually see the painting, you also sense the surface. And well, when I think of color in terms of contrast, when I think like this painting overall, if you think about the painting overall, I'm very interested in how you get a lot of information and have a clarity of reading. And the palette, even though it has a lot of colors in there, it is basically a blue and orange painting. So I'm thinking of ways of it delivering a lot of incidental detail, but having a very sort of coherent overall palette.
So does the imagery evolve out of the painting process, or do you begin with an idea about image?
No, I don't. But I don't ever end up with a purely abstract painting. So somewhere, you know, they come in somewhere. Often now I start with the, I'm using textiles in the paintings. I start, there, we could use that one, the woman with the red, yeah. The first thing I located was this red cloth in the room, so that I know where I am. And then a room started developing. And then I thought about a light source and invented this figure. And again, this is sort of blue and red, orange, complementary color.
I think I'll ask one more question maybe, and then we'll open it up. But I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more, you touched on this, about the subject of women at work, doing domestic work, farm work, or other physical labor in your paintings. You often have women holding, let's see if we can find one, holding brooms or carrying buckets of water. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
The long history of women and how they're depicted in painting. They're depicted as possessions. They're depicted as passive. They're depicted as available. And I purposely want these women to be active and have agency within their story and their pictorial reality. And they're really not posing for you. They're not voguing for you. They're going about their business, which is productive.
I realized we had a lot more to look at, so I'm just going through, and then I can open it up to questions. And I think people can type, the format, correct me if I'm wrong, right, is that people can type in their questions into the chat, and then I will read them.
Okay.
So I'll just take a few minutes to go through because there's a lot more to look at here. There's you with the broom.
Yes.
Oh, here's carrying the bucket. Actually, can you just tell us about this painting for a minute while we get questions together?
Yeah. This figure appeared on this rock. She's reveling in the sunlight. She's busy at her job of drinking, evidently. I like to add food or whatever to, the surrounding area. And I didn't, I hadn't seen this painting for a while, and I didn't remember that I had used 3 chicken legs. And it struck me when I saw it the other day, this is really funny. It made me think about 3-legged chickens.
There's always something that can't be completely explained, right? And here you're incorporating this textile into the.
Yes, and that I really started with the textile, and the lion appeared, the woman appeared.
Okay, so there is a question. I'm not sure.
Pleasure.
Are most of these more recent paintings on paper? Is the question. Are the more recent paintings on paper, I think.
What about them?
Are they on paper was the question.
But There's a few paintings on paper, but most of them are on linen. And I didn't really go through the sizes. Most of the complex compositions are at least 5 feet, up to maybe 6.5 feet.
Great. Okay, Lee is asking if you can speak to the role of printmaking and monoprints in your practice.
Ah, I love printmaking. I'm always happy to be invited to make prints. And part of it is the collaboration. I like the idea of prints being able to, because you're making an edition, you're making several that they can be sold cheaper, basically. I like the graphic, I like the figuring out of ahead of time. It's a bit like doing a performance, going and working in a print shop, where you have to be really prepared and then you make the print. I just like the whole process, and I like other people's prints as well. As I was saying, I was really inspired by Jose Guadalupe Posada, who was basically worked for the newspapers and did wood engravings. And I've looked a lot at Picasso's lino cuts, reductive lino cuts. And I've done a number myself. I like that process very much.
There's a question from Elizabeth. I like this. Can you talk more about pleasure in your paintings, both as a narrative theme and as visual pleasure for you and the viewer?
That's really great. I actually had a survey show and called it Dangerous Pleasures. I think that there is a fear of pleasure or getting too much pleasure from art, that it's suspicious. I mean, it almost feeds into my love of kitsch, where you are trying to find the tipping point of what is handsome drifting into what might be vulgar. And I kind of like to err on the side of vulgarity. I like, well, it's one of the reasons I like Ong, like all that smooth satin fabric, all that smooth skin. We really don't have that so much in painting anymore, but I'd like to see it come back in different form.
Andrew is asking, he says, I really appreciate the non-hierarchical way that you paint your figures in similar ways to the way you depict their surroundings and objects. With your interest in foreground, background conflict, are you also thinking of a subject-object confusion or conflict? Or is it still important to privilege the human experience?
So, well, I feel, I've never thought of the paint. Well, they are non-hierarchical. I mean, I like to think about a future world being really non-hierarchical. I think that that's a fantasy, but I like to think about it. And I like to think about animals that could talk. Special states of mind. So I hadn't really thought of like a medieval painting where you're privileging the donor or you're privileging the picture of Jesus over the donor. actually hadn't thought about my paintings in those terms necessarily. I mean, I did a giant painting of a kitten, and I think it was sort of very much thinking of it as being a homage in some way, honoring this kitten with a 5-by-6-foot painting.
Camilla is asking about your palette and whether the color choices are improvisational.
Not at all, really. I mean, there is a logic, and the logic is about, so I'm not thinking of local color. I'm not thinking this person is white or pink or green or blue to start out with. I'm thinking about color in terms of light, and really coming right from Matisse and his predecessor, Delacroix. It really makes the experience of the light. So it may seem strange to have a green figure on a blue donkey, let's say. But I was thinking more in terms of a medium value figure on a medium value donkey, not necessarily local color, what's referred to as local color. So it really is, it has its own logic, the way I use color, and it's out there for everybody to study.
Here's a fun question. I'm so interested in Judith's connection to California beach culture on the body and how most of your figures are nude. Curious if your family has any connections to the nudist culture in Southern California, or if this subculture plays a role in your work.
Oh, what a great question.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated with nudists. The last time I went to a nudist beach was in St. Martin's. And I didn't realize, well, I did realize it was a nudist beach, but they dropped us off. I was snorkeling. To make a long story short, we got invited to go on a nude whale watch. And it just really tickled me. I loved the idea that people have about the fantasy of going back to nature and being part of nature. And I think it's a huge part of California culture in general, in so many ways. And my family were definitely beach people. And I went to high school with surfers and actors. And I love to see the fantasy element. I am a big fan of Diane Arbus, and I love her photographs of nudist camps, because you can see it in their faces, how much they believe in the fantasy, that this is actually making them closer to nature. So, good question.
Robin says, you are such a wonderful teacher. Have any of your experiences with teaching had an influence in your art or how you think about it?
Oh, what a great question. Well, first of all, I taught at the School of Visual Arts from 1980 to 2017. And I was so lucky to have such a great job. I love art schools. I love the School of Visual Arts. It's amazing. And I had amazing students. And I just have always felt so lucky. And I pretty much taught my entire life. I taught in Oakland public schools when I was going to graduate school. I've taught in Oakland public high schools. So I have always taught, except for 6 months when I worked at the post office on the graveyard shift. sorting parcel post. And I have been forever grateful for being able to earn a semi-living by teaching. Because it's a total pleasure, really. And I'm sorry for all you people that are having to learn how to Zoom teach.
This is from Gina. Hi, Gina. How did your work change when you moved to New York?
Another good question. It didn't really change at all, strangely enough. Well, actually, a big education happened on many fronts, in that I got to see firsthand much more great art. As you know, I grew up in LA, and it has a really good museum that it has very good modern art, and that's where I developed my love of abstract expressionism. It's fully represented there. But I didn't see a Courbet until I was in my 30s. You know, now there's great paintings at the Getty, but still there's a deficit of classic Western art available to see in California. So that was a big part of my education, was just having all this great art available all the time. And my work really just grew the way it was going to grow. I mean, and the city per se never became a subject, even though, as it turns out, I've always lived in a city. San Francisco is a pretty small city, but I like a city environment, and it's a lot to do with the proximity of other artists and that conversation and how important that is for your own growth. That you have people that will listen to you and that agree that culture is important. It's very hard to sustain a practice and to teach in places that are outside the center. Maybe less so now that, you know, our world is more online, but that's certainly been my experience.
Okay, there's a question about the male gaze. Basically, to sum this up, is it possible for a male artist to paint the nude female body without exercising the male gaze? Do you wish I skipped that one?
Yeah, well, I guess it would be the same problem with novelists. Can you really empathize that the figure is fully human with all kinds of conflicts and pluses and minuses? I'm trying to think of great empathetic pictures of women that are empowering, that are done by men, not the Mona Lisa.
So empathy, the key.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way I paint those figures.
Mm-hmm.
I know how breasts hang or don't.
Great answer. Okay. Kyle asks, do you build up layers slowly, or do you make a lot of changes along the way? Or I guess that's and do you make a lot of changes along the way? Do you build up layers slowly, and do you make a lot of changes along the way?
You know, time elapses before a painting is finished. It's not like I'm working on it every day, or I'm willing to make the changes. What happens is I have to have the painting hanging around, and the painting has to tell me what it needs. And it will eventually. But it could, you know, it just takes as long as it takes. I've never been a professional artist, let's say. I mean, and some people have it really legitimately built into their process where they're making one after the other in a flow. I seem to need the whole world to be in that painting. And so it takes time to build it. And I do make radical changes. I get inspired. I say, oh my God, if that were only dark blue instead of pink, I can do it. And, you know, it could be the answer, or I could be regretful. And that's part of the allure of the process.
Jennifer, we have time for one more question.
Okay, great. Okay, this is from Rick, by Rick, who is saying, when I was in art school in the 70s, we learned to be suspicious of illustration and facility for its own sake. But I see a lot of painting these days that looks more like illustration than painting. Your work fully embraces process for arriving at the image as opposed to having an idea ahead of time. We've talked about this. Can you speak to the distinction between painting and illustration?
I have really found that to be the conundrum, because I sort of carried the DNA from abstract expressionism, and that was always the criticism. And I understand it very well. When, by those standards, when a painting arrives and it's complete in the moment, it's fantastic. And a painting that looks like it was cooked up or managed or a joint project, or it doesn't have that magic. So it's a distinction to make. But when you make that distinction, you're also eliminating ang and all kinds of artists that I really liked that are telling, they did set out to tell a story, and they did have all kinds of preparation, and they are really fully prepared and fully conscious of the event. So it gets tricky where and how to draw the line. But since I'm insisting, I'd still make the distinction, or I prefer painting that has more improvisation and energy in that way.
Great. Well, that makes terrific sense. And I just want to add one more thing to the conversation about St. Martin's. I didn't go on the whale watch, whale watch with Judy. I went to the nudist beach instead. We were down there together with our partners, and it was quite an experience. So thank you all for your wonderful questions and joining us tonight. And thank you, Judy and Jennifer, for a wonderful job. So we hope to see you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.